Thank you so much, especially to the organizers for including this still yet working paper into the program. Let me begin by saying that I thought the conference was great so far. I've learned a lot so far, and I'm particularly eager to hear your feedback on this project, especially because I and my co-author, our background is not mainly into blockchains and crypto assets, so hearing your angle on this, we think will be very valuable. All right, so let's start. So what I want to talk with you about in the next 20 minutes is about anonymity in payment system. And for that reason, we think it's useful to broadly distinguish two types of payment systems. The first is what we call token-based payment systems. And here examples are like coins, notes, or even cryptocurrencies. And the main defining feature of this category is that the trust in this payment system is maintained by the future exchange value of the tokens. So let's make a brief example. So suppose I'm a seller of goods and you're the buyer. So you want to acquire some goods from me, and you offer me some tokens. Now the question is, should I accept those tokens or not? And whether I should accept them or not is merely a function of my evaluation of the tokens. So I have to make an evaluation: how much worth are these tokens to me? Are they genuine, and so forth. However, importantly, it does not depend on my evaluation of you. I don't need to know who you are. I don't need to know your background. As long as I can validate the tokens, that's all I need to know. What this implies is that, in principle, these token-based payment systems, they can be anonymous. There's, however, also a drawback to these token-based systems, as has been emphasized by the literature so far, namely that, of course, you can only make the payments if you hold the tokens, and furthermore, holding these tokens might be costly. So imagine you holding cash in your pockets, which of course does not earn you any interest. So holding these tokens is potentially costly, and this makes a token-based payment system less efficient. A different kind of payment system is account-based payment systems. Here, examples would be checks or credit cards. Here, the idea, the principle, is a different one. Namely, the idea is that the trust in this payment system is given by a credible promise for future repayment. So, to explain this, let's go back to the example. In this case, except you giving me some kind of tokens, what you give me now is a promise. You promise me to give me something in the future. And this can be anything in principle. Could be tokens themselves, could be some real goods. It doesn't matter. What matters is that what you give to me is a promise. And whether or not I should accept your promise depends on my evaluation on how credible this promise is. And I mean, naturally, an advantage of such a kind of payment system is, well, you don't need to hold the tokens, obviously. You can, in principle, always make those promises. But the question that we want to answer is, can such a payment system, such an account-based payment system, which relies on these promises, can they be anonymous? This is the first question we try to answer. A second question is, if it is feasible to have anonymity in such an account-based system, how does it compare to a token-based payment system? So to put it differently, if we would have to design a payment system which is anonymous, should we in principle go with an account-based one or a token-based one? And before I delve into what kind of framework we're using, it's crucial, it's necessary to discuss what do we mean with anonymity, as this is at the heart of the issue. And in the paper, we distinguish between two kinds of concepts. The first is what we call strict anonymity, and if we define it as a user is strictly anonymous if all his actions are private information. And to give you some intuition what this means, I want you to give the following mental picture. Namely, imagine two people meeting at some private location. And they meet at this private location and they bargain over some terms of trade. And importantly, when they do their bargaining, there is no written record being established of what they bargain over. All right? So that there's no record to prove what kind of promises, what kind of debts are being issued vis-a-vis these counterparties. What this then, however, implies is that if there's no records, then there's no way how to prove whether someone has issued, what kind of promises someone has issued, and therefore, there is no real punishment mechanism. There's no way how to punish the buyer who issued a promise and defaulted on the promise, because there's no way to verify that. Okay, so what this means is, if with anonymity we mean strict anonymity, then it doesn't look good for the account-based payment system. However, let's weaken the notion of anonymity. And for that, we have a second concept which we call, surprisingly, weak anonymity. And here we say that a user is weakly anonymous if all his actions are public information, but it is unknown who committed these actions. And now the mental picture I want you to have is of these two people not meeting physically, but they meet over the internet and they use what we call accounts. And these accounts, what we have in mind is that these accounts are sort of like digital avatars. And the characteristics of these digital avatars is that when I meet you, I can observe your avatar's name, your account name, and I can observe everything you have done with this account. All the actions you have committed with this account are known to me, but importantly, I do not know who owns the account. Okay? And if we go with this definition of anonymity, the space for possible punishment mechanism opens up. And therefore, an account-based payment system might be feasible. And so the idea is actually very simple. So the way an account-based payment system with weak anonymity could work is if these users could build up some kind of reputation, and if this reputation were in some sense valuable to these users, then there is a punishment mechanism by which we take away the reputation if you behave badly. And if this is done in the correct way, then at the one hand, we still have the anonymity. On the other hand, there's still a punishment mechanism to incentivize the honoring of promises, the repayment of these debts. And so to summarize, what we do in the paper is we study account-based payment systems that are weakly anonymous. And we think this is a new and interesting aspect to the literature of payment systems, as this literature has mostly focused on either payment systems that are strictly anonymous or that have no anonymity at all. So we sort of try to go this middle ground way and see where it takes us. And so what we do in detail is we write down a very simple model, a very stylized model, which is based on a paper by Rocheteau and Wright. And the model looks like this. So in each period of this model, we have two types of agents. We have the buyer and the seller, and these are all homogeneous agents given their types. And so what happens is, during each morning in the period, a buyer meets a seller. They meet in a bilateral meeting, and it so happens that the seller, he can produce some goods for the buyer, but it turns out the buyer does not have anything at the moment to give to the buyer. However, the buyer can produce something for the seller in the evening. So what the buyer can do is he makes a promise to the seller to repay him in the evening. And so this is a very crude way how to model these kinds of payment systems. So of course, a credit card works is more complicated because there we would have an intermediary and so forth. But in a very fundamental way, this is a very stylized way to model this. And as I said before, the crucial innovation of the model is that these agents, they don't interact, so to say, face-to-face, but they interact using these accounts. So when the seller meets a buyer, he doesn't know the name of the person he's trading with, but he observes the entire history of actions committed with this account. So we sort of make a very strong technical assumption here to say, so let's assume that we have the technology to record everything that has been done. So all the promises that were issued, all the repayments that were done, if we could record all of this, and if the buyer could, or if all the agents could observe this. And importantly, we make no restrictions on how many accounts these agents may hold. So a buyer may in principle hold as many accounts as he wishes, and he can always create them at zero cost. So in some sense, what this means is that an agent can always erase his past. He can always create a new account and thereby hide what he has done in the past. A final assumption which we impose is that the buyers in these economies, they exit and enter the economy randomly at some point, and this sort of introduces a lifetime structure in the model. So we always have young and old buyers. And why this is an interesting aspect to have in the model, I will explain in a couple of slides. So here we have again the model in one slide. So again, in the morning, sellers meet buyers, sellers produce for the buyers make a promise to repay them in the evening. When evening comes, the buyer has to decide whether he wants to honor his promise or not. If he does not honor his promise, if he defaults on the promise he made, then this will be recorded on the account. So in future, whenever he uses the account again, all the other agents will observe that he indeed has defaulted on this account. And I forgot to mention this, but what we assume is, or that we look at an equilibrium where agents coordinate on refusing to trade with an account that has defaulted. So in some sense, in this model, if you default on your account becomes unusable. But again, you can always create a new account. Okay, and so the main result of the paper is that we show that there always exists an equilibrium where such an account-based payment system exists. And the equilibrium looks like this. So let's go through how this equilibrium works and what are the implications of this equilibrium. In this equilibrium, as I already sort of said, buyers, they gain reputation. So reputation in our model is just some discrete number, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to some maximum level. And what it means is that, for example, if you have reputation 0, it means this is a new account. You have not done anything with your account. If you start to borrow once and you repay once, your reputation increases up to 1, and so forth. So each time in this model, you take on debt, you repay it, your reputation increases by 1 discrete unit. And what this reputation in equilibrium allows you is to borrow more. So agents are willing to borrow you more if you have more reputation. And therefore, because you can borrow more, you can also consume more. An interesting implication of these kinds of this kind of equilibria is that buyers would never default in such an equilibrium. And the reason is that the sellers with whom they trade, they have, of course, an incentive to prevent that you default on them. So what they do is they set the debt limit sufficiently high so as to discourage the defaulting of the buyers. And a second related implication, maybe a somewhat surprising implication, is that the best strategy for the buyer in such an equilibrium is to in fact only ever use one account. So even though we allow agents to use as many accounts as they want, optimally they only ever use one account. And the reason for this is simple. Because the agents have one trading opportunity per period, their best strategy is to increase the reputation of their accounts as fast as possible. So whenever they would use a second account, they forego the opportunity to have leveled up the reputation on their first account. So the opportunity cost is always too high. You would always want to use your first account and level up the reputation of this one account. Also, as I already said, so why don't the buyers default? Well, because again, their reputation allows them to consume more, and if they default, they lose their reputation. And in equilibrium, so it has to be the case that the value of reputation has always to exceed the benefit of defaulting. If this were, of course, not the case, then buyers would want to default. Now, even though such an equilibrium always exists, the anonymity to obtain the anonymity is not costless. And the reason why it is costly to have anonymity is for the following reason. So, as I said, agents don't want to default because reputation is valuable. But what makes reputation valuable? Well, the value of reputation is basically how much can I consume with reputation minus how much can I consume without reputation. What this means is, if we want to make reputation valuable, we need to restrict the amount of credit and consumption for those agents with no reputation. But the crucial problem is that we cannot differentiate between those agents who have defaulted and young agents who happen to enter the economy for the first time and therefore for the first time open account with low reputation. So if we want to increase the punishment mechanism in such a system, we implicitly punish young agents. So there is this trade-off between the consumption of the newcomers, the new agents, those with low reputation, and the established users, those with high reputation. And again, let me emphasize, what we show in the paper is that this equilibrium always exists for all parameter constellations. There might be other equilibria, but this one can always be constructed. Okay, so let's see how I'm doing with time. So we still have some time left. Going to the second question. So how does it compare to a token-based payment system? And the way we model the token-based system is very straightforward. So going back to the picture. So in the evening, so we assume there is some supply of tokens. In the evening, the buyers, they may acquire those tokens, they may buy the tokens from other agents, and they hold on to these tokens overnight until the morning. And when morning comes, they exchange the tokens whenever they want to acquire the goods. There's also some exogenous growth rate, which determines the return on the tokens. So the higher the growth rate on the tokens, the lower the return on these tokens. And in equilibrium, these tokens are costly to hold because, first of all, they have to hold these tokens overnight. And second of all, the return on these tokens might be negative because, the return is negative if the growth rate of these tokens is positive. And what this means is that the more costly it is to hold these tokens, the lower the consumption is in the token-based payment system. Because tokens are costly to hold, so I want to minimize on the token holdings, and therefore cash constraint and the amount of consumption I can acquire is limited. And the main result in this paper is to show that if we can ensure that the token supply is fixed, meaning we have price stability of the tokens, then in fact a token-based payment system is always more efficient in this framework than an account-based payment system. So in some sense what this is saying is if you want to have an anonymous payment system, then the best way to go about it is to have such a token-based system and ensure that you have price stability. So maybe to visualize this a little bit, so for some parameter values, I computed this account-based payment system, which is the black line, and here we see that as the reputation increases, the amount of consumption increases. The red lines are the consumption in a token-based payment system as a function of the growth rate of these tokens, and we see that if the growth rate of these tokens is 0, then the amount of consumption is always bigger than the amount of consumption in the account-based payment system. All right. So let me conclude. So what we argue in the paper is that in principle, we can have an account-based payment system which is anonymous if with anonymity we mean weak anonymity. However, even though this might in principle be possible, even in such a very simplified world already, we can see that obtaining or making sure that we have anonymity is costly. And again, the cost comes in the form of this trade-off between the newcomers and the established users. And in fact, it's in fact always more efficient to have a token-based payment system that is anonymous if you can guarantee the price stability. We also have some extensions which maybe we can talk about later, but in essence, most of the extensions we have try to sort of add more realistic features, and all of these extensions go into the direction that the account-based payment system becomes even more inefficient, so that the conclusion that the token-based payment system is more efficient on price stability still holds. All right, thank you so much.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. So I'm gonna first put things a little bit in the context of the ways that I think it's useful to think about money and the models of money, because it's well known that generally it is kind of difficult to introduce money into models, because when you don't have any frictions, it tends to have no value in a kind of classical general equilibrium setting. So there are some example papers, and these are the three reasons why fiat money, like money that is intrinsically useless for any other purposes, might exist. So first reason is that there may be lack of double coincidence of wants in goods. People produce and consume different things, and the match might not happen. So money makes it easier to transact here. If that was the only problem, then the marketplace, or now there is internet, would solve the problem, and we might not need money for fundamental reasons. The second reason is that money might have value because there is lack of coincidence of wants across time. Somebody produces at some moment and wants to consume at a different moment. So in these settings, credit would be something that would be nicely solving this double coincidence of wants. But it might not work if there is a lack of trust. So people can default or assets can't be resold. So this is another stream of literature. And in principle, if you would have a perfect worldwide digital ledger technology with no anonymity, then we would not have a need for money in this sort of system as well. And the final reason is that if we even have perfect record-keeping devices, money might still exist because of demand for privacy. So there is an example of the paper by Kahn, McAndrews, and Roberts here, where there are agents that can trade using money, they can trade using credit, but they might get robbed every now and then, which is kind of metaphor for price discrimination and things like that. And for these reasons, there is still a value of using money because it helps to protect privacy. So this is a context of the literature, and I would recommend as a first thing the paper to discuss two second and third bullet point arguments a little bit more in the paper, because it is mainly relating to the literature of money, where the privacy and the credit as an alternative don't play a central role, and this is what your question is mainly about. Okay. Then, in terms of like the practicalities of money, indeed, there are two crude choices. So money can be a token money, the best example being a physical banknote. And what is validating this payment is that we validate that this banknote itself is valid. So everybody is trusting the note. We don't care about who sent it and who received it. As opposed to account-based system, which is of course the one more commonly used nowadays, is that what validates the payment is some sort of record-keeping system that makes sure that the amount of funds have moved from A to B. And these systems, of course, they can be non-anonymous, or at least we would maybe keep it not known by everybody in the economy, but at least banks know a few things about it. Pseudonymous, which is closest to the setting of what the paper has in mind. And this is the case for many cryptocurrencies, when instead of the individual's identities, there are some pseudonyms instead of them. And technologically, one can make these payment systems even more anonymous, even if it is based on record-keeping devices. Okay, so this is background. And what this paper does, it develops a model where agents can have multiple pseudonymous accounts. And this is kind of natural in the context when we're thinking of various cryptocurrencies, when it is indeed possible. And what this paper finds quite starkly is that, never mind that, actually the agents do effectively choose to give up their pseudonymity and anonymity in order to build a reputation in this setting. Okay, so they argue that account money is quite efficient in this framework. Okay, so giving more summary about like how the setting works. Essentially, it is a random matching model combined with a Walrasian market. So in the morning, there is a random matching between buyers and sellers. And there is some lack of double coincidence. So once in the sense that there are some sellers that are able to produce what the buyers want, but the buyer is not interested in what the seller is producing. And as a seller, there is a possibility of them essentially buying these goods using credit. And at the evenings, there is a centralized market where everything is like in the textbook, and the agents are just setting prices, trading everything efficiently. So this sequence of events is repeated every day. And what makes a trade possible in the decentralized market here is indeed building a reputation, because even so the accounts are not associated with names, but pseudonyms, like this pseudonymous accounts like gain reputation, because it is observable that what this particular pseudonym has done historically. There is, as I said, credit and delayed payments, because in the morning when the agents are interacting randomly, they make promises to produce some evening good in order to repay back what they have already consumed. Okay? And the model has quite nice way of modeling reputation, so effectively there is a parameter that goes up every time that somebody's pseudonym has made a repayment, and if there has been no repayments, then the reputation becomes negative. So at this point, because you can make more pseudonymous accounts, like effectively somebody would make a new account which starts at 0. So there is, from the point of view of the ones providing credit, these are the sellers in the morning. There is a default risk which comes from two reasons. So first, the buyers may exit for exogenous reasons. So without any strategic behavior, it's a chance that seller doesn't get paid for what they produced. Or they might choose to strategically discontinue an account and make a new one. Okay? So what the main finding is, why there is only one account that is being used, is that in this model there is endogenously some debt limit which depends on what an account's reputation is. So somebody who has some pseudonym that has a better reputation is able to borrow more and consequently to consume more. So buyers are having an incentive to fulfill their promises exactly because they aim to gain in the future, because unless they are forced to exit in the market, they expect their reputation to go up and they can borrow and consume more in the future. And indeed, because reputation is a thing that matters here, then concentrating transactions on one account rather than several accounts is what increases borrowing capacity and consumption, and hence there is no reason to hold multiple pseudonymous accounts. And as Rima was telling, there is a natural consequence of this that the agents who have been in the market longer can borrow and consume more than the newcomers. So given that, there is also a comparison with token money, and in this setting, the token money is costly because of inflation and because there can be some fork on consumption because you need to hold money balances. Okay. So I have two comments on this. First, the paper is somewhat written like as a model of money, while it is predominantly based on the model of credit. So it is a setting where offering credit is quite efficient. And we do know that building reputation is something that can enhance credit or in general facilitate cooperation, like in the spirit of folk theorem. So when it comes to that, one can also question, is a centralized market in the evening really necessary? So why not to consider something that is simpler and more in the spirit of the Kahn and co-authors papers that I mentioned before, that buyers and sellers just randomly meet and they are expecting to, with some probability, to meet again in the future. And if we have the record-keeping devices, then they can still exchange credit. So for this reason, it would be nice if the paper relates more to the Kiyotaki-Moore settings, for example, where it is indeed the case where credit could work pretty well, but because of frictions due to commitment and resellability, that is not enough alone, so we need money in addition to as well for the agents to interact in this setting. So one thing that could be interesting to consider in the case of pseudonymous accounts here is exactly thinking of the resellability, because in a way, in this case, we might think that if we know the identities of people, then somebody who has once defaulted can never go back again. And here it is possible that maybe the agents that are forced to exit for exogenous reasons could, for example, resell their account and the associated reputation. So in this spirit, maybe it would make resellability easier with some trade-offs, and that would be a nice thing to consider around pseudonyms. My second comment is about anonymity and privacy, which is an interesting question in this context. And as I said before, can be the reason why money is still useful after we have wonderful record-keeping devices. But what seems in this model is a case that there is no value of anonymity or privacy in this case. So one could think that, and in some papers that are looking into this question, the agents may value privacy because they're worried about being price discriminated against by the agents that they are buying goods for or by other agents in the economy. And or just more simply being robbed. So having these considerations in this framework, we might think that there would be more reasons for people to hold several pseudonymous accounts rather than only one. Because, going to the first point that I make here, it looks like if the agents in this setting would have a choice to give up their identity completely, they would choose to do it because it's good for their reputation. Maybe it would even be something that can be helpful for young agents who now can be seen as the ones that haven't defaulted, that are just entering the market, as opposed to the agents that have potentially defaulted in past and made a new account. Okay? So in this sense, like if the paper is about anonymity, it would be nice if it would add some benefits of anonymity and privacy in the setting. And more broadly, I think that it is better in this paper to also talk about pseudonymous accounts rather than weak anonymity, because there is a more fundamental question, is that if we know somebody's actions and we don't know their names, they are not really so private. We could still like do all these things of price discriminating against them and so on. So to finish, it is an interesting paper. The results are intuitive and it is relevant in the context of, indeed, cryptocurrencies and crypto assets, which do have these pseudonymity features. But I think it would be nice if the paper connects a little bit more with like some of the models of money where credit and money can coexist, as well as things more about like the value of privacy as one reason why money might. Thank you. Thank you.
In your model, I see I don't pay the seller, therefore I'm punished. But perhaps I don't pay the seller because I didn't buy anything, which of course is not an assumption you make in your model. So I think in general, when you stress a bit the assumption of your model, you probably need to introduce a second account, which is for the delivery of the good. For example, a more general framework would be one where there are n different sellers, and I could choose any of them, or I could not buy anything. And then how do I know when I don't see a payment, whether I should be interpreted as someone who didn't fulfill their promise, or simply someone who didn't buy anything, or didn't buy anything from a specific buyer? So it seems to be that you need then a separate system of account for each seller and the delivery of each good, in addition to the account that you already have in the model.
Yes, so we're sort of, so we have a very strict assumption on technology in the model, which basically we assume that basically everything you said, we assume can be solved technologically, which of course might not be the case. But we also have an extension to the model where we sort of go sort of a little bit the direction that you just mentioned, I think, where we sort of allow the users to basically trade with themselves. So they sort of have multiple accounts, and in order to prop up their reputation, they sort of, we call it fake trade with these trades among themselves. And in this extension, then, so as I said before, the conditions for existence become much more stricter, and the efficiency of the system also increases. I'm not quite sure if it's exactly what you have in mind, but I think it sort of goes into this direction.
Yeah, my question was about the extension you just mentioned. I mean, in the real world, I would just create bots that open 500 accounts, trade with it. I trade with myself every day, and then I screw a real merchant by taking one of my 500 high reputation accounts every day. So I don't see how this system can survive in the real world.
So what it would require is that, so what we basically assume is that when you fulfill your promises in the model, there's a technology that observes the production of actually occurring. And then it is not for free to sort of fake the system. We have also another extension which does not rely on reputation, but which relies on the fact that maybe these accounts, they are costly to create. So each time I create a new avatar, I need to pay something up in front. And in this, I think this version is more robust to exactly what you have mentioned. But I agree with your comment that these types of schemes, or what I proposed, is vulnerable to these types of schemes. But nevertheless, I think the equilibrium still exists, but again, it becomes weaker and even more inefficient compared to the token-based system. So I agree with you. Yeah.
So yeah, in a similar vein, you know, you can imagine in the real world, I can make anonymous accounts, but I can also have KYC accounts on the side. And now defaulting on my anonymous account is not going to affect my reputation for the KYC account. And so I think more realistically in the model, you would have some agents where it's just too costly to borrow KYC because of poor financial infrastructure or whatever, and some agents where it's very cheap to borrow via KYC. And then I think the concern for the lenders in the anonymous market would be that, exactly like Alfred was saying, you have some KYC person who primarily borrows in the KYC market, and then they're just using the anonymous market to build up reputation and default and get a big cash payment from the loan that they never had to repay. Right? So this might be something you might want to incorporate into the model, because this would create a sort of adverse selection problem where now in the anonymous market, I don't know who I'm lending to, whether it's somebody who has poor financial infrastructure or somebody who's just trying to default on their loan and walk away with the credit.
Yes, so that's an interesting point. So our main assumption is really that the agents, they want to be weakly anonymous in our setting. So they have sort of an exhaustless demand not to use these KYC accounts. But yeah, it's an interesting point and extension we have not yet worked on, but we're thinking about what if they have, exactly as you say, the different ways of payment. So in our model, there's really only one way to make the payment. But of course, in reality, you have multiple ways to make the payment. And this is also important because it would influence the punishment mechanism, right? Because it's no longer the relevant bench. So what determines the reputation in the model is how much can I consume if I don't have any reputation. And if without any reputation, I have a very good outside option, like using cash, then this influences the value of reputation, therefore also the efficiency of this pseudo-anonymous payment system.
You want a question before?
Could I ask about this kind of possibility for strategic trading, like whether if some traders have more information about the price, then is there some potential that using multiple accounts could be beneficial?
Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for that, because in our model, all the trades are bilateral. So, yeah, I'm not sure how to think about that in the context of this model.
So I have a question about the price stability assumption, which seems to be key, because typically that's what's the problem with token payment system as compared to credit payment system that provide more elasticity. So how do you get there in the first place? If like the supply of token is fixed, feels like some volatility on the demand or something is going to create some changes in the price, and that might be an issue for tokens, and then you have a proper trade-off between credit system and token system. And because historically that's part of the reason why we had intermediaries, banks, and even central banks providing more and more. We moved more and more towards a credit system. So it seems to be like that's an important feature. So I'm wondering how you get there.
Yeah, so I think this relates to like multiple equilibria in monetary equilibria, and so there's always, it's really hard to get rid of. So in these models with money, it's you always have equilibria where for some reason, for some sunspot, the value of money starts to decrease for some reason. But this you cannot, well, no, you can prevent it, but...
So it's more like even beyond the multiple equilibria, it feels like naturally you would have some stochasticity in the demand, and if you have something like that, then the price stability is going to move a lot, or like within the Volcker episode, you would have like a lot of volatility in the interest rates because you want to keep the the quantity of like money in the economy is stable, and you don't control the quantity, and there's no elasticity there, then the price is going to move around. So that would be something you could introduce in your model by having a stochastic demand or something like that. And then you would get a trade-off. But that would be
Yes, but also the question would be, so I think, well, at least in these models, even if you add the short-term volatility, the long run price development of these tokens is still governed by basically the trajectory of the money supply, and given you can control this trajectory, then you can control the long-term path of the price stability, given the long-term growth of the economy. That's to say. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'm not so sure whether it's a question or more a comment. Let me elaborate a bit. So what your paper is saying, that reputation is important in order to provide credit, right? But at the moment in the crypto space, I don't think that reputation is, well, no one is processing the data so far, right? So reputation does not exist yet, and then how they're solving it by now, they're doing it with collateral, right? So they over-collateralize. So have you considered maybe this in your model? Maybe reputation is not really necessary since you have over-collateralization.
So the case of collateral is actually in these models equivalent to using tokens. Because the cost of the token-based system is the same as when using collateral. Because what makes the tokens costly is that they have a return which is lower than what you would require of an asset which is not liquid. You have to hold it overnight, and so actually the same considerations applies if it's just a relabeling of token to collateral.
You're saying that reputation will be more efficient or cheaper rather than
So I'm just saying that the case what you consider the collateral token is in some sense equivalent to what we do already. Or in fact, over-collateralization would not even work in our model because one counterparty would have an incentive to run away with the collateral.
The organizer gets the chance to ask the question. You've got about a minute to go.
Now, I'm wondering what is really mechanical in your model, what is surprising? Because I mean, the trade-off that you're outlining, like the benefit from a default option versus the cheaper like consumption, that, or the fact that you can consume more, you can get more from the seller, seems like intuitive, right? So I'm wondering, like, if you take, for example, the nothing Gaussian better and more, right? Which is a searcher bargaining model, I think related to what Catherine was mentioning in her presentation. And then you basically have like the buyer and the seller would be even outside of the token or account-based payment system discussion. Just think about the seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy. The seller has some benefit from selling the asset. The buyer has like benefits from this because he needs the asset. He needs to buy the asset because he wants to consume and so on. And then you might basically have you can take exactly that model and then introduce the default and the reputation. So that would be a paper which might be of general interest even beyond discussion. So I was wondering whether.
Yeah. So the question is.
Maybe we should take.
Yeah, maybe we can take it offline, but this is more.
Okay.
Okay. So let's thank the speaker and the discussion. Thank you very much.
So before we jump into the topology, let's give a minute to talk about Lightning Network and secondary solutions in general. So secondary solutions, as we know, blockchains are slow, have very small throughput, and this is by design. This creates long confirmation times, we see high fees, and all of the problems that we associate with the space. So a pretty standard trick from financial systems is doing the following. You secure payments immediately, somewhere on the side, and then at some point you settle the whole thing in batches. In centralized finance or traditional finance, we see it, for example, in credit cards. And when we're thinking about Bitcoin, we have the Lightning Network. It's an example of a payment channel network that you will see above other blockchains also. So the basic building block of the Lightning Network is a Lightning channel. In a Lightning channel, two parties lock some funds inside of their channel. For example, Alice can lock 3 Bitcoin, Bob locks 2 Bitcoin. This is an on-chain transaction, expensive and slow. But from this point on, for example, if Alice wants to pay Bob a single Bitcoin, the only thing they need to do is change the balance inside of their channel. And now when Alice wants to pay 1 Bitcoin, now she has 2 Bitcoin and Bob has 3. There's no limit to the number of updates. They can move money back and forth as long as the funds allow it. The update is done by an exchange of signed messages between them. So this happens immediately. Suddenly, not the whole network needs to know that you're sending something to somebody. It's between whichever parties are involved in the transaction. And the important part is that there are cryptographic guarantees that allow Alice at any point to close the channel and take the balance that she owes. If Bob is cooperating, this happens very quickly. If Bob is not cooperating, there's a need to wait for a bit, but Alice will get her money whenever she wants it. An important thing about Lightning channels is that sometimes you will need to rebalance them. So if Alice sends to Bob all of the Bitcoin that she has on the channel, there will need to be a rebalancing action. One way to do it is just to go on-chain and move funds. This is slow and expensive. There are more contemporary solutions that have to do with liquidity management, but this thing we should always keep in mind when we're thinking about channels. So things become really interesting when we consider the option of routing. So let's assume Alice has a channel with Bob, and Bob has a channel with Charlie. Now Alice can pay Charlie through Bob because the Lightning Network is, well, a network, and it allows for routing. So if Alice wants to pay Charlie a single Bitcoin, she will send 1 Bitcoin to Bob, and Bob will send 1 Bitcoin to Charlie. Again, we have cryptographic guarantees that either the two things happen or none of them happen. And Bob can charge a small fee for doing this. I didn't have a place to fit it in the animation, but take my word for it. Bob gets something for providing the service. And this ability to route gives rise to what we call the Lightning Network. This is a part of a snapshot from a few months ago. In the Lightning Network, say Alice wants to pay to Zoe somewhere inside of the whole network. She will find a route that goes through the Lightning Network and send the payment through it. Currently, the route can have a bit more than 20 nodes in it. It will allow you to go back and forth, I think, 3 times through the network, so this is more than enough. But remember that Alice also has the freedom to go ahead and open a channel directly to Zoe or to some node midway that she deems good to have a channel with because it will offer her good routing possibilities. The main point is that the opening and closing of channels is completely decentralized. It's up to Alice. She decides, making her decisions, her calculations, and each node decides which channel they want. And the thing that interests us is what kind of considerations do they have in mind. So the main question in this network is how do economic forces would affect the topology of the Lightning Network? Each node decides which channel are out there. What will the Lightning Network look in general? And more specifically, we're focusing on 3 viewpoints. The first one has to do with the local changes, where a set of nodes restructures the channels that they have between themselves to be more cost efficient. We're also considering the addition of a routing node. A new node joins the system, and then a set of nodes does all of their routing just through this new node. They don't keep any channels between themselves anymore. They use the new node as a sort of a hub. And the third thing we were thinking about is the global minimal cost of a Lightning Network. So say there's some angelic figure that we all trust, and all the nodes tell it what are their needs, what is the most cost-efficient Lightning Network that can be created, and how will it look, and what are natural candidates for this kind of a network. Cool. So to talk about all of this, we of course have to present some kind of model. So we have nodes from 1 to n, and we have the net flows of these nodes. So let's have a node V, and a node V expects to get a flow of 5 from somebody, and expects to send a flow 1 to some 2 entities. We will not care who does the node expect to get, who does it expect to send. We only care about the net flow that the node desires. So in this case, for V, it's going to be 3. And we'll have other nodes in our network with some desired net flows. The one thing that we do demand from these net flows is that they will sum up to 0. Because if V is expecting to get 3 from somebody, somebody should be expecting to send this flow of 3 towards them. So we have the net flows, we have the desires of the nodes, and now we need to have channels that will provide this ability. So a channel just connects to nodes, say V and U, and it supports some net flow, lambda VU, in this example that you see, a net flow of 1. And if we're looking about directions, we'll just think that if the flow in one direction is 1, the flow in the other direction is just going to be -1. It will make calculation, things like that, simpler. Now, how do we connect channels to these desired flows of the nodes? The way we do it is that we demand that for each node, the sum of the channels that touch it adds up to their desired net flow. So as you see, for example, V's desired net flow is 3, and indeed it's receiving 4, sending 1, so V is happy. And in general, this Lightning Network respects the desired net flow F that we see up there. So this is a small spoiler. You can look at this and say, sure, this Lightning Network respects F, but that's not how I would do it. It seems like not the best way to go about it, but for us to be able to talk about the best way to go about it or the efficient way to go about it, we need to talk about costs. So the motivation when we wanted to talk about cost functions of channels and from this of networks is a previous work with the same co-authors where we were studying the cost of a single channel. So let's assume node 1 wants to send a flow of lambda 1, and node 2 wants to send a flow of lambda 2. So a result we have is that if lambda 1 is not equal lambda 2, that is, if the channel is asymmetric, this is the cost. And if the channel is symmetric, the cost is what you see here below. R is the interest rate, and B is a constant that has to do with the cost of rebalancing the channel. But the important things are, of course, the lambdas. So 2 important things that we took away from this calculation is, first of all, the very big difference between a symmetrical channel and an asymmetrical channel. So if we're looking at a first-order approximation of costs, a symmetric channel is pretty much 0. It's much, much cheaper than what happens in an asymmetric channel. The second thing of interest is that the cost of an asymmetric channel only has to do with the net flow inside of it. So we're only interested in the difference between lambda 1 and lambda 2, and not at what are these two numbers. So with this as an inspiration, we can go ahead and define what is a cost function for a channel. So we say that any function is a cost function if it satisfies 4 specific properties that are, I believe, pretty intuitive. First of all, it's monotone. The bigger the flow, the more expensive it is. Shouldn't be much of a surprise. It's symmetrical because we don't want to care about directions. It's 0 at 0. And it's sub-additive That is, I would rather have one channel with a flow of 2 than 2 channels with a flow of 1, because I have some saving on maintenance and things like that. So any function that would follow these 4 rules, we would consider it as a cost function for channels in the Lightning Network. And so back to our question, what are the topological implications of these properties? Cool. So we had 3 ways to look at things, and the first one is local changes. So let's do a quick example just to get used to this whole thing. When we're talking about local channels, we're talking about the reorganization of channels between a given subset of nodes. For example, we have this thing that we looked at earlier, and as I hinted, this works. This Lightning Network respects the flows F, but it can be better. The first thing we can notice immediately is that, these are the costs, is that there is no need to have 3 channels. We can immediately drop the channel between V and U, and then change the flows in the 2 other channels, and you see that this new Lightning Network has stricter, smaller cost than the previous one. We can also look at this for another second and say, okay, but maybe we can drop a different channel and bring the costs even lower. And indeed, if we drop the channel between V and W, the costs become even slower. So now that we can talk about costs, we have the ability to compare Lightning networks and ask what is more cost efficient. So the main result when we're considering local changes is a pretty simple one, but has powerful corollaries coming out of it. So the main theorem here is if you have a Lightning network where the direction of flows is from U to V and from V to W, you're doing something wrong. This is not cost efficient, and we can always make it better. And the way we would make it better is as follows. If lambda 1 is smaller than lambda 2, we will have a channel that goes directly from U to W, sending lambda 1, and the rest of the flow from V to W, and you can immediately see that we have lambda 1, and then a smaller channel down there. Similarly, if lambda 1 is larger, we'll have a direct channel from U to W that sends lambda 2, and the rest of the things we need will go from U to V, and again, it's an easy comparison showing that this is more cost efficient. From this pretty simple result, we have 2 very nice corollaries. The first one is saying that there is no odd cycles in a cost-efficient Lightning network. Okay, so we saw that the triangle wasn't great in a specific example. Here we have a cycle of length 7. Whatever is going on here with the flows, this is not cost minimizing, and we can do better. And then we get another direct corollary that says that if we don't have odd cycles, this means that our network is bipartite. That is, there's a set of nodes that the flow is going from them, and another set of nodes to which the flows are going, and there are no channels inside of this sets. Another thing we were considering to make the Lightning network more efficient is the addition of a routing node. So we look at a set of nodes and call it hermetizable if it can gain from the addition of a routing node. So let's assume we have these 4 nodes, they have channels between them, and then we're saying that they are hermetizable if the following process would make them better. So we start by adding a new node H that wasn't there before. Then we delete all of the channels inside of the set. And then we go ahead and open a single channel from each node to this new routing node. And then the set is hermetizable if by doing this is more cost efficient. And the 2 results that we have in this space is, first of all, if the average number of channels per node in the Lightning Network is high, this means that, first of all, there is a set that can gain from the addition of a routing node. And the set can be found pretty easily. There's a polynomial time algorithm that will tell you what is the set that you should add this new node to service it for routing. Another thing that we can say is that if we're looking at a random network where the sizes of channels are, first of all, distributed by a law that has a tail thinner than a power, and that the channels are either of size 0 or bounded away from 0, then again, it has this hermetizable set, or a set that can gain from the addition of a routing. So the punchline is here is that we expect to see a lot of additional routing nodes, making the Lightning Network more efficient. So now that we're looking at this picture here below, we could consider the question, maybe just having this one node in the middle is the most efficient way. Maybe it's the best that we have to offer, but to consider this, we need to talk about these best possibilities. So the third thing we're considering is the global minimal cost. So we denote by, we have this net flows desired by the network, and we denote by C min of F, the smallest cost of the Lightning Network that respects F. So we have a theorem that gives bounds on this smallest possible cost. It can be used for various things, but the one example that I want to consider here is using this, these lower and upper bounds to check if this one central node that everybody's connected to, can it be the best possibility? So, spoiler alert, having one central node is nice, but it's very, very rarely be the optimal choice. So, a small definition, we say we're talking about the star topology, where we have one central node, all of the nodes connected to it, and there is no other channels in the Lightning Network. So a corollary of the previous theorem is that this star topology is not optimal if there are at least two nodes with a positive desired net flow and two nodes with a negative desired net flow. And this is a very small ask, right? Because we're looking at all of the nodes in the network. It would be very, very strange if there would be a single node that everything flows towards it, or a single node that everything flows away from it. We expect to see a mix of positive and negatives. And in this case, the star topology will not be optimal. But on the other hand, it's not far from being optimal. For any set of flows F, the star topology costs at most twice the optimal thing that can happen. So, for conclusion, our results focused on three directions: local changes, the addition of a routing node, and the global minimal costs of the Lightning Network. And this results about the topology has implications for various things. First of all, it opens again some discussion about centralization in the Lightning Network. There's also quite a few attacks on the Lightning Network that heavily depend on the available topology inside of it. And the whole question of liquidity management and rebalancing is also very much connected to the topology. The paper is up on SSRN, and I think there's lots of more interesting things to do here. So, yeah, thank you for your time.
Hey, I'm Brett. Anyway, I'm excited to talk about the Lightning Network. It's super interesting, and it's a really fun paper. So before doing this, I wanted to just give a little more background on Lightning. So remember, like in 2021, El Salvador adopts Bitcoin as a second national currency. And just to think about like what this means, the Bitcoin blockchain can handle about 6 transactions per second. There's over 6 million people in El Salvador. If you divide that, each person could make about 1 transaction on the Bitcoin network every 2 weeks, approximately. So right, when they say they're going to use Bitcoin as a national currency, they really can't actually use the Bitcoin network. So you need something like Lightning for this. And you can't use a different kind of layer 2, like an Optimism and Arbitrum or something, because you need something that's built on top of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is their national currency. You can't say, like, we're all just going to use Solana, because they don't want Solana as a national currency. Right? So as we just heard, right, Lightning 2 is a layer 2 kind of payment channel network, and it's implemented as a set of 2 out of 2 multi-sig. So any 2 people can come and make a 2 out of 2 multi-sig. And this is called a channel opening. It happens on-chain. That's a Bitcoin transaction. Users deposit money in this channel, and they can deposit the same amount or different amounts. And these are sort of the maximum. It's like a debit account that they've set up between the 2 of them. And then all the intermediate payments are done on-chain, and you only pay out at the end when you close the channel, when you net out. Right, so this is the model, and there's all these cryptographic guarantees to ensure that you can't sort of close out the channel with stale payment rates. But one other practical thing I wanted to bring up here is that Lightning is kind of interesting because any 2 people can open a Lightning channel. But to do that, you need to run a Lightning node. And if you look around, most nodes are this LND, the Lightning Network daemon. Anybody can install it. You can run it. It's not too hard. I installed one, but it's kind of annoying. Like, you don't want to do that. You can't run it on your phone. So when you think about users using Lightning, an individual person cannot, like, you can't have a Lightning wallet is much heavier weight than MetaMask or something. You can't run it on your phone. So in practice, there are a lot of custodial Lightning nodes who set up a node for you, and they give you an account at their website, and they are custodying all your Bitcoin. And this kind of changes the dynamics of how people think about Lightning and how people are using it. So one example of this is Wallet of Satoshi as a Lightning Network node that gives you accounts. And so Lightning in practice is mostly custodial. Okay, so with that little bit of background, let's talk about the paper a little bit. So we saw, right, there's a model where you have a network of nodes, and they have a demand for flow. And that's given, and that's fixed at the beginning. And you have channel costs that are sublinear in all the net flows. And the question is, what is the topology that minimizes the cost of this network? Right? So you're given a fixed network. You're given a cost function that can be a very, very general cost function. And now you just want to minimize the cost. And the 2 main results, from my view, right, are that first, the optimal network in this model is a bipartite graph, where you have all the net payers on one side and you have the net payees on the other side. And then the second question is about star networks. You think star network is a really natural network. So how good is the star network? Well, we know it's not going to be optimal because it's not going to be bipartite unless the center node is either the only payer in the whole network or the only receiver in the whole network. So we know it's not going to be optimal. But they can show that it's never going to be more than a factor of 2 from optimal. And in most cases, if you have a random demand model, so if you have, say, the edges are coming in, have random demands, with this power law distribution, that the star network would be better than this thing that would come up naturally. So the star network is like not so bad. So let's dive into these results a little bit. The first result is proved in a really clean way. It's just like basically a 3-step process. They first start with this question of you have a 2-step payment. You have, A pays BX and B pays CY. And if Y is bigger than X, the arrow is a little bigger, then you can reduce costs by just moving to this thing on the right. A changes its payment directly to C, and this reduces costs. So now if you have this observation that 2-step payments are suboptimal, then you notice, well, every odd cycle has a 2-step path like this, so you can reduce the cost of every odd cycle. And so odd cycles are not optimal, but the only networks without odd cycles are bipartite. And you get this first result, and it's super clean. I thought I skipped all these slides. I had a lot of extra slides. Okay. And the second result is on star networks, right? And star networks are really natural to think about because they, they're sort of a natural network structure. You can think of a central payment processor. Previous works on Lightning had modeled this, and they bring up that these like sub-stars come up that they call bouquets. They come up all the time. And these are the results that are more complicated to prove, but that basically the intuition is the star is better than most random topologies that you come up with, and they're not that far from optimal. I'm worried that all the slides that I had skipped are still in here, but okay. So stepping back for a second, I want to talk a little bit more about like what's happening with Lightning. So here's a Lightning graph. There's lots of people in North America and in Europe who are using Lightning, and there aren't that many nodes, right? So there's currently about 16,000 Lightning nodes, and that compared to there's about 23 million distinct Bitcoin accounts. There are way more addresses, but after you do a bunch of clustering, we think there's about 23 million. So there's more than 1,000 times as many Bitcoin users as there are Lightning nodes. And the network capacity currently is really pretty low. If you sum up the value across all the channels, it's only about $150 million. So there's not like a ton of Lightning usage. And so who's using it? As I was making these slides on the chopping block, somebody says, aren't they all Bitrefill? So if you're not familiar with Bitrefill, Bitrefill is a company that allows you to buy gift cards using Bitcoin. So they run a Lightning node, and if you want to pay them with Bitcoin, you can buy these gift cards from them. Turns out that they're not. Bitrefill is like number 21. If you look at the channel capacity by number of channels, the top people are all like infrastructure providers. Like there is this like, sort of very centralized thing where you have Async, who creates one of the Lightning clients. It's not one of the most popular ones, but and there's Wallet of Satoshi, and you see Kraken is on there, and you understand why they would have a lot of channels. And one of the, all these. So one of the things, those slides say something about the number of channels, but they don't say how many payments are going on those channels, because we can't really see that, right? Bitcoin, Ethereum, they're totally public. We know everything that's happening. Lightning is like really opaque, right? The channel opens and closes are on chain, and so you see how big the channels are, and you see what the net payment was at the end. But the individual transactions are peer-to-peer, so we don't see them. So you can't actually see like how much money is going to and from Bitrefill or something like this, or Kraken. And actually, the channel opens and closes are just 2 out of 2 multi-sigs. They're not like tagged as Lightning channel open closes. They're even actually kind of hard to see, and some people argue that that's really intentional so that miners don't try to filter them out. So how do you figure out about Lightning? You run a Lightning node, and the Lightning node has to talk to the other Lightning nodes to ask for the topology. So everybody has this like local view, because if you want to route payments, you need to know what the topology is. So you run a Lightning node, and this method is really inexact. And so we have these like very vague ideas about what's happening on Lightning. And just one more thing about, we can see channel sizes, again, not how many payments, but the channel sizes. The median channel size is about $400. The mean channel size is about $2,000. And so that's the maximum amount that you can pay on this channel, the net payment you can pay on this channel. And the channel opening costs are actually really pretty high. So here's from Bitrefill. The channel opening costs are between $23 and $370 to pay for the 1 Bitcoin transaction to open the channel. So that's like actually a really big cost about opening or rebalancing these channels. There are a lot of, okay, so one problem with Lightning, right, is this custodial, non-custodial model. People have said that if you're a Lightning network operator and you want to be custodial, you'll probably have to be regulated as a money services business. And all of the, randos in the blockchain space who want to set up a Lightning node, right, don't really want to be regulated as a money services business. So if you go the non-custodial route and you say, I'm going to run my own Lightning node, and that's how we're going to scale Lightning, this is also a problem. Like if you imagine you want to have 1 billion Lightning channels that like a lot of people in the world end up using Lightning, each channel opening takes block space. Opening 1 billion channels takes about 3 years of block space. So the Bitcoin blockchain could do nothing else for 3 years just to open the 1 billion channels for these people. It'd take another 3 years to close those 1 billion channels. So you're really never going to have like a 1 billion channels between people. So there's like layer 3s that are being built on top of this. One of them is Fedimint, which I think is like kind of an interesting model. But Lightning like has either this thing that's going to be in a custodial world, or it's got to have like even a layer 3 on top of it. So I think this is kind of an interesting thing about Lightning. Okay, so back to the paper. There are a couple of things that I sort of like to see as extensions. Okay, yeah, so in this paper, right, the starting assumption is that the topology is the demand for flows is given to you, and you can now change the topology from the role of a central planner. And we see here's a simple thing that actually A changing its payment to C from B reduces the net cost, right? But B and C kind of benefit from this cost, but A doesn't necessarily. And so there's a question like, what if the nodes are strategic, right? Like, do you get anywhere close to this optimal? And so the optimality thing is a really nice first step, because now you say, okay, here's the target, right? We're aiming for this bipartite network, but if people come in, do they actually end up close to this network or not if they have their own strategic constraints? There's like a pretty rich literature on financial networks where nodes come in strategically. Here's like one of the early papers on this, not in the Lightning context, but in general. But I think that's like a sort of really natural extension to go for as a next step. The other thing I want to bring up is about the sort of cost model. So in this paper, it sort of starts with this cost model that the cost is proportional to the net flow between two channels. And this is predicated on the previous work, which has a really nice and really detailed model of cost for two channels. That includes, there's uncertainty in demand for how much payments you're going to need. There's a cost of locking capital in the channel. There's an option to ignore the channel altogether and just make the payments on layer one, and then it computes the explicit cost function. But it considers a single channel in isolation, and then you sort of take this model and say, okay, we're going to abstract that away and say, now this is the cost for the net flow. But it's not obvious to me that if you just consider a three-party network and you still have the same sort of rich cost model, so where there's like some uncertainty in demand, that actually, I think, changes in the three-party setting. Okay. So like, for example, just as this thing, we have this two-step payment, and if y is bigger than x, you have one optimal topology, and if y is less than x, you have a different optimal topology. And so if there's some uncertainty about whether y will be less than x, and there's a huge cost to opening channels, it's not clear that you want to make one of these changes, right? You want to make something, there's going to be some cost. And that's accounted for in the two-party model, because there can be no sort of topological reorganization. But it's not clear if that model really applies as well in the three-party setting. So I think that's like a really interesting question to see, like, if there's some uncertainty in the flow, what happens. And it may not be, the optimal network may not be bipartite, because you're not going to know exactly who is the net payers and the net payees. And so some types of networks might be sort of more robust than others. So anyway, I think that would be a really cool kind of extension to see. And I think that's, that's all I have there. So thanks.
Yeah, just a clarification. So when you were introducing the problem, I was thinking that you would have two topologies, one for the opening of the channel and one for the distribution of the working capital, if you want, in the node, within the nodes, because as you said, maybe you and I don't have enough money to the transaction we want to do, but because we have another channel, then the way the bitcoins are distributed across the nodes matters. But then these second aspects kind of disappeared. So maybe I missed something, so I don't know.
So in the previous work that I've mentioned, we consider given a net flow, or given the slumber one of the two people want to send each other, we also have a result of what would be the optimal channel sizes and how much each node should put inside of the channel. So this is not as clean model as I've presented here, because we need to take into consideration things that the professor has mentioned. But given the model that we have in the first paper, we can tell you exactly how much funds each node should lock inside of the channel. This answers the question.
Yes, it's already optimized for...
Yes. So here we start at the point where there is a channel with flow of lambda from node to V, and they choose the correct amounts to inside node.
So I have two quick questions. So first, I don't understand the idea of being a payee. So in my regular bank account, I can only spend the money that also comes in. So in the long run, my payment flow is zero. So
for example, if you are a coffee shop or stuff like that, you expect to have a lot of inflow, and maybe your purchases are done in fiat outside of the network or something like that.
But then I have to send the money to an exchange to convert it to fiat.
Or you pay them with Bitcoin. So for
Again, I can afford Bitcoin, right? So I have to
first of all, many people do. It's a well-known hobby. But besides that, this is, for example, if you're going to make very large and rare transactions, for example, once a month you're going to pay a big sum. In many cases, you don't want to do this over the Lightning Network. So you get the small things over the Lightning Network, and once in a while you go and use a different means of payment to make them. So your experience of Lightning Network is as a payment.
Okay. And my second question would be, if I want to be the center node of the star, then I could have tremendous bargaining power in setting high routing fees, right? So
sure, but anybody can take your so there's to some extent a free entry kind of thing. So yes, we can take large routing fees, but at some point, Alice can look at this fees and say, okay, I can just open the channel directly, and we're going to do better. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But definitely, as a routing node, first of all, you get fees, and second of all, the Lightning Network is more anonymous than the blockchain, but still you can start understanding some flows and some things that happen in the network. So being a central node is beneficial and not great for everybody else in some ways.
I had a very similar thought as Brett's concerning the uncertainty. It feels to me that if you increase the uncertainty of the payment flows, then you're going to make the star topology stronger, because it's more generic. It's going to accommodate more to different flows. I was wondering if you thought about that as a possible extension, or if that's...
I think the star topology, in general, I think it's a rule of thumb in this whole space that centralization is difficult and expensive and tiring, and then there's always this temptation just to fall back to centralization. But there are some tools that are developed to sort of try and stop this and make things more attractive, but definitely the star topology has a lot of pluses if you extend the model to something intermediate.
Yeah, so very interesting, and it's definitely valuable to optimize the network given some demands. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we could use some insight like this for the actual network, because I guess the result assumes that we know the demands, right? And there is a centralized entity that calculates the optimal topology. So in practice, where we don't know it, could there be some coordination to even optimize some local part of the network, or even how would we do it in a more time-varying manner as the demands are changing?
So, for example, especially in the local changes, for example, in this slide, there's being an example here sees the net flows from A to C, and then they can come to some kind of arrangement where he tells them this information. There's a bit of privacy, but they make something more optimal. So these are things that happen on a smaller level. When we're talking about the general, this cost minimizing topology, this will never happen, because the spirit of the Lightning Network is we would like to keep it more private. There are some private channels and private networks running around, so we'll never get anything close to the most optimal, but the small things we expect to see, and we also see the channel sizes that can hint about the size of the flow, even if you want to know exactly. So
I'm just curious about one assumption, and the plausible opposite, which I would think that potentially doesn't change big results. So you're assuming that bigger flows are more costly. Why? If you're considering also let's say some fees that you can charge in between, as well as what is observable with other means of payments that shops refuse, if they can, below $5 payments rather than above $5 payments. So if you swap the direction, it is still monotonic, but in another direction. Is it correct? The key findings will stays same regarding the star.
So some of the findings will stay the same, some of them would change. But I think it's very natural to think that there is some monotonicity when it has to do with the size of the flow, because the bigger the flow is, the more you'll need, the bigger is the amount of money you need to log in the channel to start with. And there you're already losing some interest because, you know, you could have gotten S&P 500 instead of logging all your money inside of your channel. There's a lot of costs around it. I would be surprised to see if it would have gone the other way around. And also the structural fees in the Lightning Network is proportional to the amounts you're moving together with some base fee. So currently, we do not have this structure where you can offer somebody a discount for a larger sending of amount, things like that. That being said, this is definitely something we might see in the future, and I think it's very, very interesting to consider what will happen in that case.
So it's really interesting. This analysis makes unlikely the original sort of maximalist vision of the Lightning Network as this decentralized thing that everybody on the planet uses. I'm curious though, does your math make it more useful then for something like, almost like a Bitcoin clearinghouse among centralized entities like exchanges that just need to constantly send money back and forth?
So first of all, I think the discussant brought up some very interesting ideas. There is a lot of work done right now to make the opening of channels easier and cheaper and things like that, using ZK rollups and things like that. So there is a movement to make it more efficient, more approachable. That being said, already now you see people do use this, or entities do use the Lightning Network to do exactly what you said. Sort of a clearinghouse. There's also mining pools that want to send a more continuous payment flow to their miners. This would be usually done over private networks, so they would not announce their channels to the whole Lightning Network. They will open a channel and keep it to themselves. And currently also with the developments that have to do with Taproot, now it's easier to open a channel without, you don't leave the signature of 2-to-2 kind of transaction, and then you open a channel and nobody knows that you opened a channel. So a lot of entities like that to further private kind of transactions.
I'm trying to map this onto traditional clearinghouses. And one of the benefits of the traditional clearinghouse, of course, is all the netting that goes on. And I know that the Depository Trust Company has an example. I think it's from the stock market, where the net flows are 2% of the gross flows on one day. So these are big. And I'm wondering, the amount of netting that is possible depends on what the window of time aggregation is, right? Does your model have any predictions about how that would be optimized?
So I think this is more connected to our previous paper, where we consider the two nodes are guessing what kind of flows will they have, and then the amount they choose to deposit, they want to sort of maximize the time where they can net with each other before we'll need to do some kind of rebalance inside of the specific channel. So this is something you consider when you're optimizing how do you want to construct your channel, and then from there we're trying to derive how would you optimize the whole network.
And just as a related factoid, the foreign exchange market has some centralized clearing, quite a bit, but the dominant method is still bilateral. So they do coexist in big ways.
Okay. We can take all the other questions offline. I would like to thank the two speakers, Remo and Clara.